So a very important principle is to always remember that people will judge us on what we say and how we say it, not on our intention. But we tend to judge ourselves on our intention and not as much on what we said and how we said it. And so there's almost like a built-in recipe, if we're not careful, for misunderstanding.
Yeah. I'm Telana Simpson, and let's talk communication. Often in communicating, we are trying to lead a discussion or move a conversation in a particular direction in order to achieve an outcome. One of the key skills in being able to do this is the skill of framing. In a lot of the work that I do with people to help them improve their communication skills, and specifically to deal with conflict and confrontation, this concept of framing the conversation comes up tremendously. So I wanted to learn more about framing, and so I had a conversation with Jimmy Kyriacou. Jimmy, please will you share how you came to be an NLP trainer, and perhaps just a bit about what NLP is?
Wonderful. Thanks, Telana. Pleasure to be talking to you this morning. My whole life I've been a little professor, so I've always been interested in science and philosophy and psychology, and by a very kind of roundabout route I ended up becoming a lawyer as a profession. I was an advocate for about 3 years, not a very happy one at all, and mercifully around the same time as I was discovering how unhappy I was as a lawyer, I came across NLP. This was in the late 1980s. So I did my practitioners, I did my masters, and then in 93, I went to America and did my trainer's training with Richard Bandler, who was one of the co-developers of NLP. And at the time, I wasn't intending to teach NLP as such, but what happened is I left law, I went into management consulting, and I got a phone call from a former friend, colleague, who said, I have a group of 50 people. We've organized an introductory NLP weekend, and at the last minute, the trainer that I had has let me down. Will you do it? So I said, well, when is it? And she said, it's next weekend. And then I heard this voice that I swear wasn't my own saying, okay. And so I agreed to do the weekend. Well, at the end of the weekend, I said, oh, by the way, there's this thing called an NLP practitioner's training. It's a much longer training than a weekend. And if anybody's interested, please will you stay behind and we can talk about it. So at 5 o'clock on the Sunday we finished. I said, okay, we're finished, you can go now. And everybody stayed behind to talk about the practitioners. So I signed up, on the day, a full practitioner training of 20 people. And with relatively few exceptions, I've taught NLP practitioners every year since then. So I've been doing it for a very long time. Then in 2001, I was certified as a trainer in Michael Hall's Neuro-Semantics, which I'm sure we'll be talking about later. And in 2004, I was fortunate to be invited to attend the MetaCoach training. So I'm very much somebody who's got the NLP, Neuro-Semantics, and MetaCoach background. So that's a little bit of my background, and I'm still interested in philosophy, still interested in science. So I'm a permanent student. I do a lot of formal and informal studying and have done so for many years. So in a moment, I'll say a little bit more about what NLP is, but I'm wondering if there's anything you might want to say in terms of background or ask.
No, I know. I think that gives a nice kind of overview of you. So then, because obviously the reason we want to talk today is is around a specific skill in communication that is called framing. But if we can just explain a bit about the cognitive behavioral sciences of NLP and neurosemantics, just to give the context.
Wonderful. So the simplest way for a non-NLPer to make sense of what it is that we're talking about is just to unpack the term Neuro Linguistic and Programming. And basically the premise is that in the last 50 years, we've learned more about the brain and applied neuroscience than we have in all of human history. And every 5 to 10 years, that knowledge is growing exponentially. So with improved technology, we're able to peer deeper and deeper into the brain. There are things like functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a kind of a brain scan device. So we're at the point now where we can literally identify a single thought and its precise location in the brain. So that's the extent of the technology that's developed. So the neuro part in NLP stands for the brain and the nervous system. And what we're trying to do in NLP is to take some of this quite sophisticated neuroscience and make it user-friendly and practical. The term linguistics refers to language, but in the NLP understanding, language can be verbal or non-verbal. So right now, as we're having our conversation, you're hearing my words, but you may also notice the hands going back and forth. So there's gestures, there's facial expressions, there's tone of voice, there's body posture, even breathing. All of that is communicating at a non-verbal level. So that's the linguistic parts of NLP. We are very careful to pay attention to what a person is saying and also how they're saying it. And then finally, the programming part has got to do with a method or a system. So we're not trying to program anybody in a particular way. We're just recognizing that we operate with so-called mental recipes. The technical word for that would be strategies. And by understanding both our own strategies, our mental recipes, those of others, we can then work at a much more cognitive level in helping people to either improve strategies that are not working too well, or to even learn other people's strategies and adapt them so that they are applicable to themselves. So that's kind of the basic introduction to the NLP part. I can also say a little bit about the background of Neuro-Semantics and how it's similar in many ways, but it's also different in many respects. So Dr. Michael Hall was a student of Richard Bandler's and became a trainer under Richard, and eventually went on in his own way developing and training NLP. And he was doing work in the field of resilience. Resilience is the idea that people who are knocked down some way, whether physically, emotionally, spiritually, people who are resilient have the ability to bounce back, as it were. And it's quite remarkable because things that might affect one person very badly, if we have this character of resilience, the strategy of resilience, we're able to bounce back much more effectively. So what Michael noticed is there's a certain type of way of thinking, a meta-state, which is a thought about another thought, or a feeling about a feeling, that is operating at a higher level, as it were. So later on, when we talk about frames, I'll refer to frames as meta-states. So what is a meta-state? It's a higher level thought. For example, if one were just to become aware of one's own thinking, the psychologists call that metacognition. It's a higher level awareness of what one's thinking is. So Michael noticed these meta-states that NLP was already aware of, but he started to explore it more deeply. And it's almost like, taking a little bit of a thread on an old shirt. As he began to tug more and more on this idea of a meta-state, a whole new field began to unravel, which he then called Neuro-Semantics. And it's sufficiently different from NLP to have a different name, but it's sufficiently close to NLP to rest on NLP as a foundation. So I'm a very strong believer that NLP and Neuro-Semantics are like the first floor and the second floor of a building. So NLP is kind of the foundation, and then NLP, Neuro-Semantics is this higher level phenomenon. So in order to be an excellent neurosemantic practitioner, we need that foundation of NLP that the Neuro-Semantics is resting on. But for the NLPers, Neuro-Semantics provides a whole new universe of distinctions and concepts and techniques to play with. So it's an ideal combination.
It is, and it's a very interesting field. I mean, that's how we met, is studying the field of neurosemantics and that. So I want to ask you then just a bit about conversations that count, because that's part of the idea of these podcasts that I'm doing. So when was the last time you had a conversation that you believe really counted?
Sure. I'll have to think about that. I suppose in one sense we can say that every conversation counts. And in the field of coaching, there's no question that every single coaching conversation is one that counts. So my most recent one, without giving away any confidence, was with a client who is facing a life-threatening illness, and they're having to make some important decisions about where to go with that. And so, without being an expert in medicine or even in decision-making around medical conditions, what I needed to do was to listen at a very deep level, to ask the kinds of questions that would enable me to appreciate where this person was coming from and the choices and options that they were facing. And then through the tools of NLP and Neuro-Semantics and just opening my heart to this person to try and intuit, as it were, where is this person's own unconscious appearing to point them? And then to test that, to check, okay, so what I'm hearing, what I'm understanding is you seem to be favoring this option rather than that one. Is that correct? So that would be a kind of a conversation that counts.
Yeah.
It happened only yesterday.
So then just on a high level, because we're going to go in depth into one of the skills, but on a high level, what then are some of the communication skills that you personally developed that enable you to have that kind of conversation? So I know you spoke about listening as one of them, but are there any other things that you believe you pull on in order to have that meaningful conversation?
Sure. So there's a number of skills, and just to say a little bit more about listening, most people think that they listen. The challenge, though, is we don't listen with our full attention. And so, criticism of communication, is that somebody's listening but they're not hearing. So we want to be in a place where we can listen very deeply. And so there's a kind of a more fundamental skill before listening, which we call sensory acuity, or having one's senses open and clear of other clutter. And there are exercises of a kind of a meditative nature that allow us to come to a place of expanded awareness where we see more, hear more, feel more, and that allows us then to listen at a much deeper level. So listening is definitely a key skill. A second key skill, and these are the kinds of things that are taught on a standard NLP, Neuro-Semantics, or coaching training, is the skill of asking good questions. And part of the asking good questions is to have a linguistic model, a set of distinctions in language that allows us to recognize that when a certain expression is used, there's a typical type of question that we might ask when that particular type of communication is offered. Because typically in language, the speaker is going to delete certain things that they feel are unimportant or that may be uncomfortable. They're going to generalize for the sake of saving time, because it's time-consuming to list every item, and so one might generalize and say that something always happens or it never happens. And then one might also end up inadvertently distorting one's communication. So using the meta model of NLP, one is trained to recognize the type of communication that's been offered and then to ask precise questions to recover the particular information that was missing. And then a final skill that I think is absolutely fundamental is what in everyday language we call empathy. NLP describes it as rapport. And there are things that one can do at a behavioral level, at an emotional level, and even at a deeply individual or personal level to connect with a person in such a way that the other person feels heard and understood and cared for. So between the listening, the asking good questions, and the deep rapport, communication then tends to go a long way. So the only remaining challenge then is to have the presence of mind and to be in a good state oneself, to be open and willing to listen, to ask quality questions, and to engage in a rapport.
Because when you have those things in place, you can then have a conversation that can actually shift things or move things, bring a lot of meaning too. Because I think that so much of our world today and the way we interact with other people is all through some form of communication. That's how we get to know about the other or move things or create businesses or anything that, is. So part of that then is, in a lot of the work I do with clients and we're learning about how to confront people, how do we get our message across, how do we get, understood by someone else. And for me, a key part of that is the concept of framing. And that's what I wanted to just move to and focus on, because it's a very useful. We do it naturally, but it's also very useful to know about it so you can do it more consciously. So just to start off, what is framing as a communication skill?
Sure. So to begin with, the word framing itself in NLP and conversations is basically a metaphor. And it's a metaphor that comes from an actual picture frame. So if you were to imagine a picture frame that's on the shelf or on the piano, as it were, what you have is a frame and a picture. And the frame of the picture is doing three things, basically. The first thing that it's doing is it's creating a boundary around the picture to say, this is inside and this is outside. So the larger the frame, the larger the picture that you can get inside of it. So the first function of the frame is to set the boundary of what's inside and what's outside. The second function of the frame is that it keeps the picture in place. So if you just had a photograph or a picture sitting there, it would get blown away by the wind, it would fall over, it would get a whole lot of dust in it. So the frame maintains whatever the content is in a particular position. And then the final thing that the frame does, there are many things that it does, but the third thing that it does is it gives a certain quality or texture to the picture itself. For example, if you had a picture of let's say my grandmother, chances are it would not be in a chrome or a gold frame that was modern and trendy. The frame would create a quality or a texture to the picture that didn't quite fit. So for my grandmother, we would be more likely to see like a twirly, old-fashioned, maybe even a wooden, or if it was gold, it would also be kind of intricate. And so it would match the type of picture that was there. Similarly, if I had a picture of a Ferrari or a jet airplane, I wouldn't put that in a wooden frame that was old and, gave a kind of a classic feel. So the frame tells you how to interpret the picture or the content. So if we then take it from picture framing to language, a frame is a thought which keeps another thought in place. It may texture or qualify the second thought by telling you how to understand the original thought. And it also tells you what's in the scope of the conversation versus what's outside of the conversation. So framing is a very, very important concept in language. But after this somewhat technical description, let me give you a bit of an example. So if a young girl goes up to her mom and she says, "Mom, I don't want you to worry," immediately we have a frame. And that setting the frame or setting the stage is giving mom an indication of the next thing that the little girl is going to say. So she's going to tell her that she broke her favorite glass, or that she's lost her books, or she forgot her lunchbox at school. So the first thought operates as a pre-frame. It's saying, I'm setting the stage in a certain way, and I'm pre-framing. It's a frame before another frame, the conversation that's going to come. So that's a kind of an example of a frame in action. And we can have a pre-frame that happens before another frame. We can have a frame that happens after an event, such as when we apologize, or when we explain that something happened but I didn't mean it, or we give a reason or an excuse as to why it happened. We can deframe when we use our language to take the power away from a frame that's been set. And we can even outframe when we step completely outside the boundaries that have been set by the frame to give a completely different perspective or way of looking at something. So framing does tend to be a very powerful, a very advanced linguistic skill, and at the same time it's something that we're all doing naturally every day of our lives in a communication.
So then what are some of the ideas or principles that we can keep in mind so that we can not only develop the skill, but I suppose use it? Because for me, there's two sides. One is to you as the communicator. If you have a message to give, if you understand about framing, you can set the, because in NLP we talk about the person who sets the frame controls the game. So if you want to get a message across, if you think about how to set the frame, you can influence that your message is more likely to be delivered in the way that you're intending it for. And then the other side is also to be aware of frames, so that when someone else is communicating to you, you can listen for, what is the context within which they are trying to speak to me. Do you have anything?
That's great. That's perfect. So, sure, a couple of things that are very important to bear in mind. So one of them we've already touched on, which is this idea that in any communication there's both verbal communication and non-verbal communication going on. So a very important principle is to remember that in any communication, there's not just one communication that's happening. We're communicating on multiple levels. Some of it is verbal, and some of it is nonverbal. So already the nonverbal communication sets a frame. My posture, my gestures, my facial expression, my tone of voice, all of that is creating a frame that says, this is how you can understand my communication. So if I'm smiling, that's sending a message of friendliness that if my words have a somewhat harsh or serious tone to them, the smile will texture or modify the communication to say, maybe I'm joking, maybe I'm being sarcastic. So it gives us more information in terms of how to interpret the words. The other thing that's important is the context that we're in will make a very important contribution to the frame. So if we're in a pub and there's a comedian and he's making fun of somebody, even if he says something that would ordinarily be interpreted as insulting, we know from the context of the comedian in the pub and everybody's laughing and having fun and having a drink or two, that this is meant to be a joke. And so that context sets a frame. So for a good communicator, the two take-home lessons then is to be very sensitive to the context that we're in, and secondly, to be very aware of our nonverbal communication. Those would be two very important principles. And then the final thing that we could say is, because we are not just saying one thing, we can also help the person that's listening to us in terms of the words that we use to say, I'm going to share something with you. I'd like you to understand it in a certain way. Or, here's my intention in what I'm about to say. So by clarifying how we would like the person to interpret our communication, or by clarifying our intention also with other words, other explanations, the likelihood of being misunderstood is enormously reduced. So those would be three very important principles: the nonverbal aspect, the context, and choosing one's context wherever possible, and then finally explaining before and after what we say, the how we intend or would like the communication to be understood.
So great. And then, so maybe then just talk a bit more about what the pre-framing and the post-framing. Because there's also, like I say, and I've heard that if you don't do enough pre-framing up front, sometimes you end up having to do a lot more post-framing. So it's I can't remember what the actual the word is, but for me that speaks to being much more conscious and aware before you go into a communication. So in other words, there's a level of preparation. So when you're training, or if you're going to run a meeting with your team, if you're going to do a speech, as a leader for your organization, if you're going to go into the media to talk, if you are going to, discipline your child. So many of those contexts, if you just do enough preparation up front and think about the frame, as we've been saying, the boundary, the interpretation that you want to get across, and how you can pre-frame it, that results in a much better outcome than just blurting out whatever is on your mind and then realizing you have to post-frame.
Exactly. So again, what's really important is to understand that there is a lot more going on in the communication than just two people going back and forth. One thing that's going on is I'm expressing my words in a certain way, and that's the part that is visible and shared. What's not visible or shared is the intention behind it. So that intention is always going to be invisible unless I somehow communicate my intention. Similarly, for my listener, I'm only going to see their facial expressions, hear their words, but their intention is going to be invisible to me unless they find a way to share that. So a very important principle is to always remember that people will judge us on what we say and how we say it, not on our intention. But we tend to judge ourselves on our intention and not as much on what we said and how we said it. And so there's almost like a built-in recipe, if we're not careful, for misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Because I will always be coming from my intention, and the other person will be perceiving me from my behavior. And my listener will always be coming from their intention, but all I've got to go on is their behavior. So to give you an example of pre-framing, a young student sent an email to her mother, and she said, "Mom, I'm just writing to let you know that I'm recovering from my broken leg. I may not have mentioned that I broke my leg when I jumped out of my boyfriend's, first floor apartment. We've been living together for about 6 months, and somebody left a cigarette, lit, and the place caught fire. And, the doctors say that my baby is going to be fine. I'm 6 months pregnant. I probably didn't mention that either. So I'm just writing to kind of let you know that things are fine." And then at the bottom of the page, she wrote, "I don't have a broken leg. I don't have a boyfriend. I'm not pregnant. There wasn't a fire. But I did fail my chemistry exam. I just wanted you to put things in perspective." So that's a great example of pre-framing.
Extreme example.
The very clever student is now setting a frame that, in light of all the other things that could have gone wrong, just getting an E on the chemistry exam is minor by comparison. So that's a very clever and humorous example of pre-framing in action. So little ways that we can pre-frame is by helping people, for example, understand what's the purpose of the communication. So if we're having a meeting, what's the agenda? What are we going to be talking about? What time is the meeting starting? What time do we anticipate that it's going to finish? What rules or boundaries are there about issues to be discussed at the meeting? And then if there are particular issues that are going to be discussed of a possibly sensitive nature, we might want to give people information up front to consider. We might even want to canvass by having a one-on-one meeting with some of the participants to appreciate where they're coming from and what their position is, so that by the time we get to the meeting, we as the leader of the meeting, the chairperson, are not going to be surprised. We've already done a fair amount of pre-framing and preparing so that we know where the conversation is likely to go. These are important tips that can happen, for example, in a group context. In a coaching conversation, a pre-framing type conversation would be to explain to the client the nature of a coaching conversation, to make the distinction, for example, between coaching and therapy, to ask for permission if I'm going to be taking short bullet point notes to refresh my memory, to explain that our conversation is confidential and that it stays between us. These are all important pre-frames that help the client to understand that they can feel rested and assured that they're in good hands. Otherwise, we run the risk of, towards the end of the conversation or even halfway through the conversation, we discover the client seems reluctant to share something only because we haven't clarified that the conversation is confidential, and now the client is feeling reticent and hesitant to share what's coming. So all these kinds of pre-frames will save us a lot of time in the long run because we are clarifying them up front.
And so then just to go back to your example of the coaching client who then is reluctant to share, that would be then where post-framing would be an opportunity for post-framing. Because there then the coach would need to explain about confidentiality, and so kind of have to put that boundary now in place and redefine the context, and probably to have to do a bit more work to create that trust then. But that would be where post-framing
exactly
would come in.
Exactly. So if we hadn't done such a great job of pre-framing, because there's so many things, right? We could spend half an hour of pre-framing, and we don't have that time. So we really want to just identify the 5 minutes worth of the most important things to pre-frame, and then hopefully coming back to that sensory acuity that I was describing, the ability to see more and hear more and to be 100% present, to notice, oh, my client has been a little bit reticent. What's that about? And to explore that, and then if I haven't explained it already, to then explain, oh, here's something that I forgot to mention. This conversation is entirely confidential. It's not going to be shared with anybody. It stays between us. So that then allows the client to have that level of comfort. So post-framing is setting the frame after the event, when either we haven't had the opportunity or didn't think to do the pre-framing up front. So if something does come up, we can say, oh, by the way, I should have mentioned, and then we do the post-frame.
Great. And then just another part of framing is, we call it reframing. I wonder if we could just touch a bit on that, because that for me is really, really interesting. It's almost like you can change the meaning of whatever has happened by giving it a new frame. That's how I understand reframing. Is that right?
Yes. That's right. That's right. So there are multiple ways to reframe. So basically, a reframe is to frame again, to give it a different frame from the one that it had before, and in NLP we call this reframing. The 2 most basic kinds of reframing are what we call a content reframe and a context reframe. And then there are advanced kinds of reframe, which are called the sleight of mouth patterns. In Neuro-Semantics we call them mind lines. And then we have as many as 24 very elegant and very clever ways of reframing something. So just to stay with the basic forms of reframing, earlier we talked about how the frame is setting a way for the picture to be interpreted. So the 2 kinds of reframe are either to change the frame. So if I've got an old kind of wooden, damaged, broken frame around my grandmother's picture, if I then do put it in a somewhat more modern frame, that's immediately going to reframe the picture, even though it's the same picture. So it might create a picture that is interpreted as possibly more modern. So somebody might ask me, oh, is that your daughter? But actually it's my grandmother. It's just, because of the frame that it creates a certain meaning. A second thing that we could do is to replace the picture itself. So if we take the picture and replace it with a different picture. That then is what we call a content reframe. We're changing the actual content, and that too is going to give us a completely different experience of what it is that we're looking at. So to turn this into a tangible example, if a parent comes to me and says, you know, my child is talkative and cheeky, and you know, they don't listen to what I have to say, and you know, I'd really like you to coach them to change their behavior, or coach me in terms of how to handle it. I might say, gee, your child must be very intelligent to have so much to say. So instantly we're taking this behavior of talking a lot and not listening as not a sign of disrespect or disobedience, but as a sign of intelligence. So we're saying, it's not this, it's that. This would be a content reframe. We're saying we're changing the picture from a picture of a disobedient child to a picture of a highly intelligent child, so instantly there's a reframe. Now, the parent will have to interpret that reframe through their model of the world to go, oh, wow, that's amazing, I didn't think of it. Or they might go, no, that particular frame doesn't work for me. You know, I don't buy that. It's causing problems in other areas, so that would then be an invitation to our own flexibility to come up with a second reframe. So we might then go for a content reframe. Sorry, we've tried the content reframe. Yes. We might want to go to a context reframe to say, okay, isn't it great that when your son is older, they'll be able to take good care of themselves? So now we're keeping the picture the same, but we're finding an example of a different context where this ability to say a lot and to not listen, and you know, is actually going to be a skill that will be helpful later on. So these are, you know, kind of silly examples, but they make the point of we have the choice to either keep the content and find a different context where the same behavior is an advantage, or we can keep the frame but find a way of saying it's not what you thought it was, it's actually something else that's worth preserving. So these are two kinds of reframes. And then at an advanced level, as I said, we can play with the other 24 or so advanced reframes.
Yes. So then just one thing I want to reframe, in terms of framing, sometimes, you know, I hear people say to me, but that sounds very manipulative, you know, when you go in and you're setting the frame in order to control the great game, because that's like a fun way of explaining it. So how would you then reframe that? Because for me, it's more about being influential than being manipulative.
Sure. So the important thing to bear in mind is that the word manipulate in the dictionary has two different meanings. The first meaning of the word manipulate is completely neutral. It's not a negative word, it's completely neutral, and it has to do with moving something with intent. And in fact, if one's going to a chiropractor, the chiropractor is going to do a manipulation.
Yes.
And we actually pay the money and say, please, will you do this for me? So in that sense, manipulate is a neutral, a neutral event or activity. We don't have a problem with doing something deliberately. The second meaning, though, is negative and not entirely ethical. And this is where we do something at face value, but we have a hidden agenda or an unethical intention. So there, it's not the behavior that's manipulative. It's the reason behind the behavior. And in that sense, any behavior can be manipulated. So if I said good morning, but my intention was to trick the person into trusting me so that later on I could steal their money, that would be manipulative. But we don't normally think of saying good morning as manipulative. But what that example points out is it's not the behavior, it's the intention. So to really appreciate manipulation in the negative sense, we have to understand that there are two things: the behavior and the reason that I'm doing it. So to come back to the question that you mentioned, if my purpose in pre-framing the coaching conversation or the meeting is so that everybody's on the same page, so that we can move quickly and effectively to a win-win solution, then there's no possible way that the pre-framing or the framing is manipulative. Mm. It's actually positive, even though I'm doing it deliberately. But if my intention is not ethical, if I have an ulterior motive or a hidden agenda, then even saying good morning and being nice to people would be taken as manipulative.
Yeah.
Then the final thing that I just want to say about that is, if we come back to the fundamentals of NLP and good coaching, when we are listening deeply and wanting to ask good questions and deeply trying to come into rapport with the other person so that we appreciate where they're coming from, it's very hard to be manipulative in the negative sense, because our heart is open and we're actually caring for the other person. So even though it's true that people can fake sincerity, it's very hard to pull off.
Yeah.
So manipulation always tends to backfire, if not in the short term, then in the long term. So the skills of NLP and the experience that I have of teaching these skills to hundreds of people over nearly 20 years is that it makes one a better, more effective communicator and a more caring and loving person. So like I said, even though any tool can be manipulated, if one is really using the skills of NLP to their full extent, then it's very hard to be unethical, and it tends more naturally to lead to win-win solutions.
Mm. Great. I think that as we wrap up then for this morning, how can people get hold of you if they want to know more about what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Telana. That's been great. 3 basic ways to get hold of me. My website is www.inlp, so NLP with an I in front of it, .co.za. And my email address is jimmy@inlp.co.za. Jimmy, J-I-M-M-Y, @inlp.co.za. And then people are welcome to give me a call or send me an SMS on my cell phone, 082-570-4483. 082-570-4483.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Jimmy, for sharing your knowledge around the skill of framing and communication. I'm Telana Simpson, and this has been Let's Talk Communication. For more information, you can follow me on iTunes or YouTube, or you can visit my website at talkcommunication.innercoaching.co.za. Thanks for listening.